A shrill, ear-splitting shriek tore through the night, followed by the horrifying sound of thousands of tons of reinforced concrete snapping apart like brittle candy. It was Miami's final scream before being swallowed whole. Coastal skyscraper towers, symbols of American wealth, were completely peeled open by the wind, their glass skins shredded into a rain of razor blades that sliced everything below. Glittering Collins Avenue was now a battlefield, where million-dollar yachts were hurled onto shore by the tsunami, crushing heaps of mangled supercars. Cut to New York. The global financial heart was stopping. The Wall Street trading floor sank beneath a pitch-black sea, and underground, the legendary subway system turned into gigantic water-filled coffins. Thousands of passengers were trapped in desperate darkness, with only the gurgling roar of rising water. What is happening to the world's #1 superpower? This time, the enemy isn't a foreign army. And it isn't a nuclear weapon. It's Freddy, an atmospheric monster that refuses to die. A zombie storm that ran against nature's laws, crossed 2 oceans, and absorbed all the heat of the boiling seas to evolve into a Category 6 superstorm. It came to prove a brutal truth. Before Mother Nature's fury, mankind's greatest works are nothing but fragile sandcastles against the waves. At 10 a.m., the sun hung overhead at the National Hurricane Center in Miami, but the air inside the control room was cold as a morgue. Dozens of radar screens flashed the same solid red, blood red, danger red as its speed swallowed the entire Florida peninsula. America's top meteorologists now stood frozen in silence. Coffee cups on the table trembled not from an earthquake, but from hands shaking uncontrollably as they tried to record the data. They were witnessing the impossible, an event that violated every rule in a century of meteorology textbooks. Freddy, a name that should have been crossed off the watch list 3 days ago, was a corpse drifting in from Africa, a savage tropical depression that had breathed its last in the cold mid-Atlantic. But nature, enraged by climate change, decided to resurrect it. A fateful, brutal coincidence struck as Freddy's remnants drifted into the gateway of the Gulf of Mexico. An abnormally hot current surged up from the south, turning the entire Gulf into a giant pot of soup, with sea surface temperatures hitting an unbelievable 97 degrees Fahrenheit, fuel for a storm. 97-degree water is no different than tossing a burning match into a jet fuel tank. Instantly, that corpse jolted awake. From a harmless speck of cloud, Freddy made a gruesome U-turn, drinking in the ocean's raw heat to be reborn. On satellite screens, they could clearly see explosive rapid intensification at a mind-bending speed. In less than 12 hours, the central pressure plunged without brakes, free-falling to 850 megabytes. That's a number from hell, lower than Super Typhoon Tip, the strongest storm ever recorded. Wind scales started breaking. Category 5 was no longer enough to describe this monster. For the first time in U.S. meteorological history, scientists trembled as they whispered a term that had only existed in doomsday theories. A Category 6 superstorm. Freddy's eye opened wide. Round and pitch black like a cosmic black hole swallowing light with a diameter of up to 62 miles. That Reaper's gaze was locked on Florida's coastline without blinking. Meanwhile, on the ground, nature began issuing terrifying warnings that only the sharpest AIs could detect. Across the Florida Keys, America's tourist paradise, the sky suddenly changed. 10. Not the usual storm cloud gray, but an eerie neon green. That sickly dim light often signals extreme cold air colliding with saturated heat, an omen that baseball-sized hail is about to come crashing down. Beneath the surface, the ocean began behaving as if it were afraid. Along the famous South Beach shoreline, the sea suddenly pulled far back, exposing bare seabed, white dead coral formations, and the wrecks of ships from the 18th century. Yachts at anchor abruptly ran aground, tilting on soaked sand. Curious tourists rushed out, phones raised to film, never realizing this was death exhaling before throwing its killing punch. The ocean was retreating to build momentum for a 50-foot wall of water about to slam in. Deep in the Everglades marshes, the natural order completely inverted. Thousands of alligators, cold-blooded killers that had never known fear, now crawled onto scorching asphalt roads in unison. They charged into neighborhoods, wedging under cars, smashing garage doors to find shelter. Flocks of seagulls spiraled wildly, slamming into skyscrapers like madmen. The land itself seemed to heave up in waves, writhing as if the earth were cooking something monstrous beneath the surface. But the most terrifying sign didn't come through the eyes, it came through the human body. Atmospheric pressure dropped too fast, making the air feel strangely thin and heavy at the same time. Sensitive people in Miami began to feel their chests crushed, like a 1,000-pound boulder pressing down. Their ears rang and throbbed with savage pain, like diving deep underwater without protection. Orange-red blood began seeping from the noses of children and the elderly. That was pressure trauma syndrome. And Freddy hadn't even touched land yet, just its breath from far offshore was already enough to choke life on the coast. Then, human society's chaos officially exploded when the civil defense sirens wailed not the familiar stop-and-start drill tone Floridians knew, but one long, continuous, ear-splitting blast that echoed through every corner of the city, from the slums to the million-dollar beachfront mansions. At the same time, 22 million cell phones across the state buzzed violently. An emergency alert system message appeared on a blazing red screen in all caps, hitting like a punch to the gut. Extreme threat, no chance of survival if you stay, evacuate immediately. Walmart and Target turned into war zones. People trampled each other to fight for the last bottles of water. Shelves were stripped bare in minutes, glass shattering, screams, gunshots ringing out at gas stations as fuel ran dry. The ancient law of the strong crushing the weak returned right in the heart of 21st century America. On the highways heading north, the worst traffic disaster in history began to form. Millions of cars crawled forward inch by inch, forming motionless rivers of metal stretching for hundreds of miles. Luxury cars, beat-up trucks, everything locked in place, turning into scorching steel cages under the muggy pre-storm heat. People began abandoning their cars and running on foot. But where could they run when the eastern sky was slowly turning black as ink? At the 7-mile bridge linking the islands, desperation hit its peak. Thousands of vehicles were trapped between endless water on both sides. They could neither move forward nor turn back. All around them, the sea began to rise. Waves licked at the bridge supports. The wind started to scream in violent bursts, ripping car doors off those reckless enough to open them. Faces pressed against windshields warped with terror, stared out toward the distant offshore, where the horizon had vanished. Only a towering wall of pitch-black clouds remained. It came rolling in with the growl of millions of starving demons. Freddy had arrived, and it had no intention of knocking. It came to bring the house down. 1:15 a.m. The moment of judgment had come. No knock, no prelude. Freddy slammed into land with the brutality of a deranged executioner. The instant the leading edge of the eye wall touched Miami's coastline, meteorological instruments at the port of Miami recorded a number that made the specialists in the command center stop breathing. Wind gusts at 255 miles per hour. This was no longer moving air at this speed. The wind became a solid object. It was like an invisible concrete wall racing at the speed of a race car, slamming into the city without slowing down. The Royal Palms icons of Ocean Drive, historic witnesses that had stood there for half a century, were ripped out of the ground instantly. They didn't fall, they were fired like gigantic arrows. Trunks weighing thousands of pounds flew through the air, punching through reinforced concrete hotel walls, pinning themselves there like spikes driven into the flesh of a giant. But the most horrifying sight came from the pride of modern architecture: glass-wrapped skyscrapers. Under wind pressure more than 3 times their design limits, millions of tempered glass panels from luxury high-rises detonated at once. The sound of shattering glass was no longer a tinkling crash. It thundered like a heavy machine gun firing non-stop. A rain of glass, sharp as razor blades, poured down from a height of about 985 feet. The shards were swept along at supersonic speed, turning into an artillery storm that minced everything below. The supercars parked on the streets weren't just flipped over. Their metal skins were sanded down, torn open paint and flesh stripped away by billions of flying glass fragments. Miami, once glittering with lights, was now tearing itself apart piece by piece in a blazing dance of death. And then the ocean hit. The storm-driven tsunami didn't rise slowly like a tide. It stood up into a pitch-black wall of water 50 feet high, as tall as a 5-story building, and slammed into the coast with the weight of the entire sea. The famous South Beach district vanished in a single blink. Seawater blasted into the streets with the force of a freight train. It didn't push past obstacles, it crushed them. beachfront restaurants, packed bars, wooden lifeguard stations, everything shattered into floating rubble. Water surged into parking basements, turning these underground spaces into sealed water tombs. Thousands of cars were lifted and smashed together, triggering thousands of hopeless car alarms that dissolved into the roar of the waves. No one could hear anything. Human screams were completely swallowed by nature's fury. After 4 hours of non-stop torture, suddenly everything stopped. The wind died, the rain quit, and silence crashed down so abruptly it made people's ears ache. It was the eye, the epicenter of the monster Freddy, passing directly over the city. This was the most dangerous moment, nature's cruelest trap. The night sky above the storm's core was bizarrely clear, revealing glittering stars that seemed to mock the suffering below. Survivors, naively believing the nightmare was over, began crawling out from the rubble. What they saw was surreal. A colossal Roman Colosseum formed by sheer white cloud walls encircling them, rising up to 9 miles high. They spun in silence, but this fake calm lasted only 20 minutes before the back half slammed in. The wind flipped 180 degrees. This was the finishing blow. Skyscrapers that had already been bent one way in the first round were now wrenched back in the opposite direction. No matter how strong reinforced concrete is, it can't endure that kind of savage torsion. The steel rebar snapping inside the columns sounded like the bones of a gigantic creature breaking. A 60-story tower in Brickell's financial district began to shake violently. It let out ear-splitting metallic groans, then slowly collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete fell in freefall, pulling neighboring buildings down in a destructive domino effect. Cement dust billowed up, but was instantly drowned by rainwater, turning into thick mud that smothered whatever was left of a civilization. Underground, the fight for survival unfolded in absolute darkness. Florida's power grid had completely collapsed. Inside flooded homes, people groped through pitch-black water rising up to their necks. Sewage mixed with leaking gasoline and rotting animal carcasses, creating a choking stench so foul it was hard to breathe. Families climbed into attics, what they thought was their last refuge, only to realize they had locked themselves into a dead end. The water kept rising, forcing them closer and closer to the ceiling. Children screamed. Adults pounded on the roof, begging for help in vain. Outside, the wind howled in waves, as if it wanted to tear that fragile life away. In major hospitals, backup generators in the basements were flooded and exploded in the very first hour. Doctors and nurses had to use phone flashlights to keep ventilated patients alive, but the phone batteries were draining fast. One by one, the tiny points of light went out in the hospital corridors, handing the space back to darkness and death. The storm didn't stop at Miami. With the colossal energy it had built up, Freddy kept crawling north along the coastline, hunting for its next victims. Orlando, Jacksonville, and farther still, the historic cities of Georgia were on the chopping block. At the same time, seismic monitoring stations recorded strange tremors, the weight of billions of tons of rainwater and seawater pressing down on the Earth's crust. Florida, built on porous limestone, began to suffer widespread subsidence. Giant sinkholes suddenly opened in the middle of roads, swallowing fire trucks and rescue teams trying to reach the disaster zone. The ground was no longer safe. The sky was the enemy. The ocean was the monster. Humans were trapped in between, smaller and more helpless than ever. When the faint dawn finally appeared behind the thick cloud cover, it didn't bring the light of hope. That dull, lead-gray glow only revealed the scale of destruction even more clearly. There was no coastline anymore. Florida's map had been redrawn overnight. The beautiful peninsula now looked like a shattered archipelago, cut apart by vast rivers of salt water. And Freddy the monster still hadn't weakened. It was turning its bloodshot eye toward the capital, Washington, D.C., carrying a death sentence for the entire U.S. East Coast. 48 hours after the nightmare named Freddy began tearing through the American East Coast, the world woke up in shock, realizing a superpower had been knocked down. When the last remnants of cloud finally cleared, military satellites from an altitude of about 311 miles sent back the first photos that left the Pentagon speechless. America's map had changed forever. The Florida Keys, those jewel-like tourist islands, had completely vanished from the surface, becoming concrete coral reefs submerged under about 33 feet of water. Florida's coastline was gouged and ragged, like flesh ripped by a wild beast. The peninsula's once flat terrain became its death sentence. The sea didn't retreat. Florida today was an extension of the Gulf of Mexico. But the physical destruction was only the beginning of a far more horrific chain disaster: the collapse of the digital economy. Freddy didn't just strike homes, it hit the brain of the modern world. Northern Virginia and the areas around Washington, D.C., often called the world's internet crossroads, where around 70% of global web data is housed, were hit by massive flooding. Giant data centers belonging to Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, despite state-of-the-art flood defenses, still fell to record-breaking water levels. The consequences were immediate and brutal. This wasn't just losing the internet for browsing, it was the financial system going blind. A dark Monday morning, the New York Stock Exchange couldn't open not because the building was flooded, but because trading data had been wiped out or was inaccessible. Major banks were paralyzed. Billions of credit card transactions were declined worldwide. In London, Tokyo, Singapore, electronic boards glowed red as investors panic sold. The US dollar went into freefall. A global depression was triggered in just hours, vaporizing trillions of dollars in assets. A civilization built on digital clouds was drowned by a very real cloud of water, back on the ground, at the disaster's epicenter. A black tide was silently killing the survivors. Along the Gulf Coast and the industrial zones of Texas and Louisiana, dozens of refineries and chemical storage facilities had their protective shells ripped apart by the storm. Millions of barrels of crude oil, industrial chemicals, pesticides, and medical radioactive waste spilled out, mixing with floodwater into a thick, pitch-black, extremely toxic slurry. This water wasn't just dirty, it was acidic. It ate into the flesh of people trying to wade through it to reach dry ground. The chemical stench was so strong it burned the lining of the lungs the moment you breathed it in. Bodies floating on the surface began decomposing rapidly in the tropical heat, returning after the storm, creating a massive breeding ground for disease. Cholera, typhoid, and flesh-eating bacteria began to outbreak. With no clean water, people were forced to drink that deadly contaminated water, and death came to them more painfully than ever after the storm passed. And when the law disappeared, the survival instinct rose up in its most brutal form. In isolated cities like Miami or New Orleans, civilized society evaporated as fast as rain on hot asphalt. Local police completely collapsed, their headquarters flooded, patrol cars swept away, and they themselves were scrambling to save their own families. Chaos exploded. Street gangs armed with heavy weapons seized the last remaining patches of high-ground supermarkets, gun stores, and pharmacies were stripped clean, not a single item left. Gunfire rang out non-stop in broad daylight over a case of bottled water or a gas can. Friendly neighbors from yesterday were now ready to point guns at each other to protect the last scraps of food. Faced with total loss of control, the White House, running on emergency generators, was forced into the most painful decision in modern history: activating the Insurrection Act. The president declared martial law across 5 eastern states for the first time since the U.S. Civil War. The regular military was deployed on American soil with authority to fire on its own citizens to restore order. Amphibious Humvees and Abrams tanks rolled down flooded streets, gun barrels aimed at crowds furious and desperate. The image of U.S. soldiers pointing rifles at starving civilians became a symbol of the collapse of the American dream. But the superpower's greatest humiliation lay offshore. The Norfolk port system, home to the world's largest naval base, was completely paralyzed. Nuclear aircraft carriers worth billions of dollars were smashed onto shore and left stranded like giant whales. The most powerful fleet on the planet was now frozen, unable to deploy. The United States had to do something it had never imagined: send an international distress signal, SOS. Answering the call, rescue ships from the European Union, China, and Russia began appearing on the Atlantic horizon. Foreign flags flew over U.S. sovereign waters not as invaders, but as saviors. A bitter reversal of history. But the sea was still violently restless. 5-meter residual waves about 16 feet made reaching the coastline impossible. Tons of aid sat on ships only a few nautical miles from starving people, yet felt as unreachable as another planet. On land, darkness swallowed everything as night fell. No power. No city lights, only the flicker of flames from burning trash piles and the sound of helicopters circling overhead. Neighborhoods that once glittered with light became dead islands. Screams for help echoed from pitch-black high-rises, but no one answered. The official casualty count still couldn't be compiled, but sociologists estimated it had surpassed the total deaths of the U.S. Civil War. Hundreds of thousands were missing beneath the mud. Unidentified bodies were piled into makeshift refrigerated containers. The stench of death blanketed a vast region, stretching from Florida all the way up to Maryland. Freddy had passed, but it left behind a crippled America, kneeling in the rubble of its own arrogance. The economy was paralyzed. Society was fractured. The environment was poisoned. This was not a short-term crisis. This was the end of an era. Dawn on the fifth day finally arrived, but it was not the dawn of hope. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a sickly brass-colored light on an America that felt completely unfamiliar. No car horns, no jazz in the streets, no roar of billion-dollar trades. Silence, an eerie, chilling silence covered everything. At New York's gateway, the Statue of Liberty still stood, but more lonely and battered than ever. Black sea water thick with oil slicks had risen to the statue's waist, turning the greatest symbol of the American dream into a tragic flood gauge. Times Square, the place that never slept, was now a deadly canyon, where massive LED screens were dark, reflecting collapsed buildings and the drifting wrecks of yellow taxis. Freddy had vanished into nothingness, but it left behind an eternal message carved into the Earth's crust. This storm was not a random accident. It wasn't bad luck. It was the fair price for humanity's arrogance. For a century, we have been heating the oceans, turning our shared home into a giant pressure cooker. We loaded the gun pressed to our own temple with our own hands, then naively believed technology or money could somehow make it safe to pull the trigger. But Freddy proved the opposite. Before the fury of the Blue Planet, every superpower is equal. Every rich-poor boundary is erased by mud. America will be rebuilt. Buildings will rise again. But the scar Freddy left on the map and in the minds of those who survived will never heal. The era of humans mastering nature ended at this moment. We are living only by the fragile mercy of an angry planet.